1. Welcome to another test-driven design video where we will apply the TDD pattern of writing clean code to an interesting case study in our everyday life. The case study we will use involves the three national government branches of the Republic of South Africa. We have the legislative, executive, and the judicial branches. Each of these branches have specific responsibilities in government, which we will not focus on for the purpose of this video. The focus will be on implementing a specific requirement, which is to create a system that stores entity-specific responsibilities for each branch in government. Let's first refresh our minds on a solid principle that will drive the design of our implementation, and it reads as follows. The Interface Segregation Principle encourages small, focused interfaces tailored to specific needs instead of forcing a class to implement large, general-purpose interfaces. A class should not be forced to depend on interfaces it doesn't use. Create smaller, focused interfaces instead of one large general-purpose interface. Now let us switch to IntelliJ and start writing a unit test for some interface. What you see is a newly created Java project using Maven build tools, with boilerplate code. Let's start by creating a test class where we will add our unit tests. We will use the pattern we learned in the previous video. You can find the link in the description below. First, we need to see a failing test. We now have a failing test. The next step is to make it pass. At this stage, we know that we are testing a unit of work that should return a responsibility which we will assign to some data type. In this instance, we can define a generic local variable for the expected result. Next, we have to define an interface that specifically forces a class to implement a method that returns a responsibility. By making use of the refactoring tools, we can generate an interface from our unit test, which we can name responsible. Let's define a member in the interface that forces any class that implements it to implement a get method for returning a responsibility in the form of a string. We choose a string at this point because the aim is to get the unit test to pass. We have created our interface which contains no concrete implementation of the get method. Therefore, we need to stub or mock a return for the method when it is executed on line 12. Before we refactor our code, let us add another interface that forces a class to implement a method for a specific branch of government. Let's refresh our minds on the various national government branches once more. Let's introduce an interface for the legislative branch with a specific responsibility. We need to first define a unit test that will assert the result returned by the newly introduced interface. Let's now mock a return for the get method defined in the LegislativeResponsible interface, which we will use to segregate the implementation of the concrete class focused on the responsibility of the legislative branch. We have now successfully implemented 2 unit tests referencing 2 different interfaces. One interface has a general purpose for forcing classes to implement a GET method that returns a general responsibility. The other is a smaller, focused interface that forces classes to implement the same method that returns a specific responsibility. We can now refactor our code and implement the more focused interface, which in this case is the LegislativeResponsible interface. We already know that we are introducing a concrete class that implements the LegislativeResponsible interface. Therefore, we don't need to have a failing test since we know what to expect from the output, which in this context is the focused interface. The last check in our unit test verifies the specific output of the implemented GET method. We finally have a passing test for the first branch of government. In your IDE, implement the rest of the branches using the pattern and share your solution in the GIT repo. You can find the link to the repo in the description. I would love to see your implementation. Thank you for contributing to our TDD lessons.